Now, this panel just spoke to us about the importance of the business community and of partnerships with the theme of resilience. But how can cities leverage whole ecosystems of support for entrepreneurs to build better lives for themselves and their families? And how can we ensure every resident gets a fair shot at it? The Kauffman Foundation has been a leader in bringing attention to the tools that can improve urban life through education and entrepreneurship. And no one has done more work on this topic than our next speakers. Bruce Katz is acknowledged internationally for his insights. He is director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University. He regularly advises global, national, state, regional, and municipal leaders on public reforms and private innovations that advance the well-being of metropolitan areas and their counties. Katz is the co-author of The New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism, and The Metropolitan Revolution, How Cities and Metros Are Fixing Our Broken Politics and Fragile Economy. Also joining us on this panel is Melissa Roberts Chapman, a senior program officer and expert on kickstarting entrepreneurship for the Ewing, Marion, Kauffman Foundation. She manages a diverse grant portfolio that focuses on supporting the foundation's work within the Kansas City regional area and collaborations with and convenes multiple stakeholders that support entrepreneurs to help fortify Kansas City's entrepreneurship ecosystem and take those ideas to the rest of America. Melissa and Bruce, welcome. I'm honored to moderate your discussion.
Great to see you.
It's good to see you. So we're gonna dive right in. We are gonna be looking a lot on the how, and I wanna start off by having each one of you talk to us about your specific current work that you're doing to create accessibly urban opportunities. And let's go ahead and start with you first, Melissa.
Great, well, thank you. Hello, Bruce, it's good to see you again. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for taking your time to join us today. I've been listening to the chat and I'm excited to hear the questions that you have for us later in the program. As was said, I'm a senior program officer at the Ewing, Marion, Kauffman Foundation. We're a philanthropy based in Kansas City that was founded by what you might today call a life sciences entrepreneur. Mr. K, as we call him, built Marion Labs, a pharmaceutical company, in his basement here in Kansas City and sold it many years later to become Marion Merrill Dow, which you might today recognize as Sanofi. So we work at the Kauffman Foundation with communities in entrepreneurship and education to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to make or take a great job in their lifetime. And our work is really focused around 3 pillars. The first is inclusive prosperity, making sure that everyone truly has an opportunity to make a great life for themselves and their families. The second is developing the 21st century workforce that has the skills that they need to make or take those jobs. And the final piece is really promoting an entrepreneur-centric view of economic development in the 21st century. So within the foundation, I lead a team that's focused specifically on building an entrepreneurial ecosystem in what we call the heartland, but you could think of that as our own backyard. It's what we call the Mink states: Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. And so being based in Kansas City, we're very active locally, and I look forward to talking with you all about some of the perspective that we have here in the middle of the country that we think can be instructive to others, but also really getting the chance to step back and to look at the challenges in front of us from a 10,000-foot view. I think in this time, in this year, to think about a smart city really requires a different view. Real smart development is accessible to everyone in a city. And I think that is what I'm excited to talk more about today.
Very good. We're excited to learn more about how we can do that, how it can be accessible. Bruce, tell us about your work, your specific work.
Well, I'm mostly living on Zoom, like everyone else.
Yeah.
But Melissa, it's great to see you. And for everyone on the call, the Kauffman Foundation is really a must go-to center for really cutting edge research on both an entrepreneurial-led economy shaping, but also new thinking about finance. And I would highly recommend people go to their website. Since March, I feel like I've been living in a witness protection program to some extent, intensely focused on how to help cities respond to what essentially is a massive collapse in small business, and particularly Black and Brown-owned business. And I think what we saw from the federal government was a crisis-led response that at the end of the day mostly favored small businesses with several hundred employees that had friendly relationships with traditional banks, and overlooked a very small, underbanked, under-resourced, under-networked Main Street businesses, particularly Black and Brown-owned. And we are going to be set back by essentially the federal government using a one-size-fits-all relief package, when we really needed to harness all the energies and all the talents and all the capital to basically sort of fit to a broader continuum of businesses. So we've been helping cities respond. We've been advising federal policy. We really hoped that Senator Booker's Relief for Main Street Act, which would have sent $50 billion directly to cities and counties to help shore up very small businesses, particularly those around main streets and business districts, would have passed. Federal government is essentially pursuing a level of malpractice that we have not seen in a very long time. And going forward, we're working with Accelerator for America, a network, a nonprofit led by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti that Kauffman's a member of, to help cities, A, understand their starting point on small business, a small business scorecard as the crisis persists. B, what's the strength of their ecosystem? Procurement, supplier diversity, business support, access to capital, business district regeneration. And finally, what are the two or three strategies that cities can undertake by themselves and then use to deploy federal resources if and when they come? And so an intense focus on small business, I really think we're relearning what Jane Jacobs wrote about cities 50 years ago. Small businesses are the lifeblood of cities. And we are going to come out of this crisis with a need to restart and reimagine their role.
So that carries us really straight into the meat of this conversation. How can we begin building these ecosystems, right, to help support entrepreneurs and create, innovative opportunities for them? And I know you spoke a little bit, Bruce, about, banks, and Melissa and I have discussed this earlier with community banks, but walk us through that. How can we create, how can we begin building these ecosystems, effectively? Melissa, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is to recognize right now that not all sorts of businesses have the same capital needs. And I know that sounds very basic. But to really start to build an ecosystem that serves all entrepreneurs in our city, we first have to understand the continuum of business growth and the experience of entrepreneurs on the ground. So like any, I think, great community building activity, this one ought to start with listening to entrepreneurs. What we have found as we have gone through that process is that there are a lot of different sources of capital today, but for many different reasons, whether they're regulatory, whether they're based on bias, whether they're based on structural inequities, and certainly all of those are present. The capital sources that we have right now are not meeting entrepreneurs' needs as they start and grow businesses. So when you look at concepts like the vast wealth differential that we have in this country between, for instance, white households and Black households. And you also say that to get a business loan, it requires you to put up collateral or to have a great personal credit score. Those requirements are mutually exclusive. We can't possibly build a healthy ecosystem when at the same time we're putting rules and regulations in place that prevent more than half of the people in our ecosystem from even having the opportunity to access the very earliest stages of capital. So when we think about building a healthy capital ecosystem, it includes questioning a lot of the basic parts of the system that exist today. The first kind of question I think that we would pose is really, is what is the right form of capital? What's the right capital model? Is it debt? Is it equity? Are there new forms of capital that we should be focused on that can be more equitable? Things like revenue-based financing, which we've really dived into lately through the work of our Capital Access Lab project. The second question is, what are the requirements around that capital? Are we requiring, in essence, to have wealth in order to build wealth? And today, so often we are. And so I think if we can start to really pose those critical questions to the systems, I think we'll all be better off. And I think if you are someone who in your city is starting to have these conversations, I'd encourage you to start by listening to the entrepreneurs in your own city to understand the barriers that they see.
Very good. Bruce, would you like to add to that?
I think that's really an excellent overview. We really need different forms of capital that's fit to purpose here. And when we talk about small business, we have almost, a one-size debt-focused model that really doesn't work for large numbers of entrepreneurs and enterprise. We've built a very sophisticated model on the venture side. Angel seed, Series A, Series B, and frankly, in most parts of the US, we've built very sophisticated ecosystems, advanced research institutions, mature companies, startups, scale up, accelerators, incubators, yada, yada, yada. We don't have that on the small business side. We just don't have it. We don't have intermediaries with the capacity, capital, and community standing to source new entrepreneurs and help lead them and help enable them to realize their dreams with the right kind of capital that fit the purpose. There's an enormous amount of capital out there, like a ridiculous amount of capital out there, but it's not harnessed to really fit. So next week we'll be putting out a report, myself and 10 other colleagues, called Big Ideas for Small Business, which really calls for a complete reimagining of our whole federal and national infrastructure. Capital, supply, demand, support, data, research. I mean, frankly, we don't even know how many businesses we've lost because the data is completely out of whack. So this is a time for radical reinvention, both on the private side and on the public side. And I think there are some early green shoots and nascent, fledgling initiatives that we can build from. But we should use this period to really construct a completely different system.
Very good. And your event sounds really fascinating, Bruce, that's upcoming. It sounds very relevant to the conversation we're having today. So if there's a website you want to share with us in the chat at some point, that would be great too for our attendees. Yeah. Can we dive a little bit deeper into community banks? Like, what is their role? We've been talking about partnerships in the past panel, and I'm thinking this is, along those lines. What can community banks do to help entrepreneurs during this pandemic? And maybe Melissa can walk us through a little bit more on CDFI and explain this to our attendees and what that could mean for entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. So I think the first piece of context is that you have to realize that there are different kinds of banks in the world. So for those of you who already have your finance degree, you can feel free to turn off for the next 10 seconds of the conversation. But there are really two core kinds of banks in the world. There are financial institutions, investment banks, and then there are community banks, which are the branches that you see as you drive down the street in your own community, or you don't. And that's really the core of the problem. I live in Kansas City, which is, in the core of a region, a Fed region, that is deeply, deeply reliant on community banking. We don't have major financial institutions or investment banks that are based here in Kansas City. And so when we think about the importance of community banking traditionally, I think it's been based around a couple of core things. The first is the relationships that community bankers hold in their communities. If you think back to things like It's a Wonderful Life, people knew who George Bailey was. And I think today there are very few people, and certainly the people that do know their own, quote unquote, George Bailey, are probably people who sit in a place of some degree of privilege. And so to recognize that the fundamental relationships, which is the strength of community banking, has changed is really important. The second is that, the changes in the regulation of banks, especially small banks, have put a greater regulatory burden on those banks, and that has forced consolidation in the market. That consolidation has not only impacted the number of banks that exist in our communities, but also where those banks are. So in the last 20 years, the number of, for instance, Black-owned community banks in this country was cut in half. So when you think about how today focused we are on what our networks look like, our networks tend to look like ourselves. And you think about statistics like that, the fact that there are half as many community banks that are owned by Black people in this country as there were 20 years ago, that has a massive impact on the access of relationships that people have to a community banker. And so when the Community Reinvestment Act was passed in the 1970s to combat some of the traditional banking ills that we know have changed the face of our communities quite literally, things like redlining. There was also, a different kind of alternative bank that emerged from that called a community development financial institution. And in the age of COVID, these CDFIs have become so important in communities across the country in providing access to microloans, especially. And certainly we've seen that here in Kansas City. We have a great alt-cap here locally, a great CDFI here locally called alt-cap that I've done quite a lot of work with. And that was really the core of our response at the foundation to the shutdowns that came with COVID-19 in Kansas City. We worked to help de-risk capital in this CDFI locally that had a huge impact on the pool of microloans available in our community, and also the entrepreneurs that had access to capital. Because what we found here locally during COVID-19 and the PPP lending that followed was, first off, there was very little great information, and secondly, the loans were not equitably available.
Bruce, I wanted to ask you something in particular because I know we've got just a few more minutes, but in an article that you recently published, you spoke about remaking U.S. institutions, post-crisis, as all of this is fitting together post the pandemic. Can you help walk us through a successful process and what that would look like?
Well, we're going through a process right now in Cincinnati, and this is a great example. So if you think about the collapse of small businesses and Black-owned businesses, brown-owned businesses, it's going to have a domino effect on downtowns, midtowns, commercial corridors, main streets. We all know this. I mean, these are ghost towns right now. And so the question is, how do you regenerate these nodes of commerce and centers of civic life? Because if we don't do that, the confidence that people will have to renew the economy will be greatly circumscribed. So in Cincinnati, we've been working with Fifth Third Bank, the Port, which is the Urban Land Bank, CDFI, to build on Melissa's point, the major foundation, groups of eds and meds and large corporations and Main Street business alliances or organizations to say, we need a new kind of regeneration alliance that can quickly, nimbly, seamlessly match procurement and purchasing of services coming out of universities or hospitals or corporations with small businesses located in business districts, can take those small businesses and walk them through a business plan so they can access the right kind of capital so they can scale up to provide those goods and services, connect small businesses with the right real estate options, help landlords, small landlords, fill their buildings, which will be vacant. So the bottom line is we have lots of different kinds of institutions, entities, organizations, but it's no one's job waking up every day at the city level, county level, metro level to connect the dots. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to need a lot more dot connecting in the aftermath of this crisis and as the crisis proceeds, So Cincinnati, I think, will be a first mover on this Regeneration Alliance, because it's not about let's create a whole new entity.
Mhm.
There are a whole bunch of entities, but we need to have the matching function, the linking between supply and demand and capital and real estate happen faster. That flywheel that works on the tech side in the US now has to work on the small business and business district side.
Very good. Thank you both. We are actually at the tail end of our discussion. We can go on and on about this topic, of course, but I really appreciate your time, Melissa and Bruce. Thank you for joining us today.